Hustler music, hustler music, hustler music.
Welcome back to the channel, GNG fam. As you can tell from the thumbnail, you already see what's going on, right? You got Russia invading Ukraine. Why is Russia invading Ukraine? Well, Ukraine don't want to, sign that deal and go over there and be part, back into the union with them. And, the Western Ukraine, I ain't gonna sit here and explain it to you. I'm gonna let those people do their job, and I'm gonna do my job by just getting to you in layman terms a little bit more easier. So I broke it down in this video so you can understand it a little bit more easier than how the network's gonna rock your butt to sleep. So pay attention, stay firm. I know it's a tad bit long of a video, but stay with it and you're going to get a full understanding of what's been going on over there in that area of Europe, Eastern Europe, going into, Russia. Let's get it.
Tensions are rising over the conflict in eastern Ukraine after a massive Russian military build-up near its border with the region. More than 100,000 Russian troops have been strategically placed close to the border they share with Ukraine, and many experts are seriously worried. So, are we on the brink of a new war?
We're now at a stage where Russia could at any point launch an attack on Ukraine. I would say that's more stark than we have been.
To understand what's going on, we're going to explain the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how it's led to what's happening today. First, let's look at how Russia and Ukraine are linked. Their history goes back as far as the 9th century, when a group of people called the Rus moved their capital to Kiev. During the 10th and 11th centuries, it became the largest and most powerful state in Europe. It laid the foundation for the national identity of Ukrainians and Russians. So what would become Russian culture began in Kiev before moving east to Moscow. Ukraine would become part of the Russian Empire for centuries and would also be part of the USSR. Putin is obsessed by Russia and Ukraine's long pre-1991 history as one country. In July 2021, Putin released an epic 7,000-word essay about their shared history, in which he said, quote, "I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia, for we are one people." The thing is, most Ukrainians don't agree with that version of history. Also fueling Putin's obsession with Ukraine is the events of 1991. Putin, as a young KGB intelligence officer, watched the Berlin Wall crumble, his beloved Soviet Union collapse. Since then, he's been on a mission to return Russia to what he believes is its rightful place on the world stage. The fall of communism at the end of the Cold War saw the former Soviet states turn westward, ditching their Russian rulers and turning to Europe's west and the US to create new economic, political and cultural futures. In 1991, Ukraine gained its independence from the Soviet Union. For 31 years, Ukraine has had its own sovereignty and been an independent country. But that independence hangs in the balance. Putin is driven by a sense of righting what he sees as history's wrongs. He wants to reverse what he views as the humiliating breakup of the Soviet Union more than 30 years ago. But also at the heart of this conflict is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation.
Here's a list of the founding members of NATO, and here's the reason why. World War II plays a major part in this. So pay attention to World War II and where all the disaster happened at. You know, they had to rebuild all that area and all that, so those countries owe to those other countries. Understand?
NATO was founded in 1949 after World War II to protect against Soviet aggression. NATO was founded in 1949 after World War II
to protect against Soviet aggression.
The Soviet Union was so big of a powerful nation, they had to break it down to get to the source of who is the power, and that's Russia.
The treaty states that if one nation is invaded or attacked by a third party, all nations in NATO will collectively mobilise in its defence. The alliance has since expanded to 30 countries, including a number of former USSR states.
While the Western world was bribing the other countries with liberty, sovereign, and independence, they was just basically, getting the return on being able to be right next door to Russia. NATO's whole objective was to continuously tear down the Soviet Union. This is just a simple case of divide and conquer. So you will see why Putin would want to try to fight back.
The Kremlin is furious at those former Soviet states joining the treaty, seeing NATO's presence on Russia's border as a threat. Now, Putin has demanded guarantees from NATO that Ukraine and Georgia, another former Soviet republic that Russia briefly invaded in 2008, never be allowed to join the alliance. But NATO allies say Putin cannot deny Ukraine or any country that right. Ukraine has long fought to join NATO and is still working on making that goal a reality. To say Putin hates NATO would be an understatement. April 2008 was the last time Putin attended a NATO meeting. The Russian president said then that allowing Ukraine to join NATO would be a direct threat to Russian security. He told the US and German leaders, quote, "For me, Ukraine is not a real country." Now, Russia claims that in the early 90s, at the end of the Cold War, the US pledged that they would not let NATO expand eastward. But that claim has been debunked, including by the former Russian President Gorbachev. The topic was never discussed. Now, those arguments are completely ignored by Vladimir Putin. So they're the historical ties between Russia and Ukraine.
Will Russia go to war with Ukraine? All week, you've heard numerous answers to this question. In Ukraine, 71% of the people believe their country is already at war with Russia. This is a complex crisis, and all the answers are hidden in history. Did you know there was a time when Kiev was more powerful than Moscow? There was also a time when Ukraine and America were adversaries. Tonight, we'll bring you all these stories. We will tell you why Russian President Vladimir Putin is obsessed with Ukraine. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay, and this is Gravitas Plus. We begin in the 9th century. There was a state called Kievan Rus. This is where it was located. The Slavic people lived here. The city of Kiev was their capital. Between 980 and 1015, the Kievan Rus was ruled by Grand Prince Volodymyr. In Russian, his name is Vladimir. In Ukrainian, Volodymyr. And as fate would have it, these are also the names of the presidents of these two countries today. Anyway, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians draw their lineage from this Slavic state. A lot changed in the centuries that followed, and for a lot of it, Ukraine was under Russian rule. In the 1900s, the two were Soviet republics. Russia, the most powerful of the 15 republics, and Ukraine, the second most powerful. It had defense industries, large agricultural lands, and housed much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. During the Cold War, Ukraine was the arch rival of the United States. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Ukraine became independent, as did Russia. Ukraine inherited much of Soviet nuclear arsenal, but gave it up to Russia in 1994. In exchange, Moscow guaranteed Ukraine's security and promised to respect its sovereignty. They signed the Budapest Memorandum along with these countries. Cut to November 2013, Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine. He had a reputation for heavy-handedness, corruption, and above all, for being openly pro-Moscow. In 2013, he rejected an EU trade deal. This deal could have meant greater integration with the European Union. Instead, Yanukovych decided to take a $15 billion bailout from Russia. To many Ukrainians, it felt like being sold to Moscow, so protests broke out. They were called Euromaidan. Euro because these protests were about Europe, and Maidan because they happened in Kiev's Maidan, what we today know as the Independence Square. Here, protesters chanted, "Sign the EU deal, Yanukovych must step down." Russia supported the president, the West supported the protesters. In February 2014, Yanukovych's government was toppled, the president was driven out of Ukraine, he fled to Russia. Not every Ukrainian was happy with this. Many in the Russian-speaking East wanted Yanukovych to stay. When he was driven out, the minority felt disenfranchised. On the other side of the border, Russia was angry it had lost its puppet. To salvage the situation, Moscow annexed Crimea. Why Crimea? Well, let's now zoom into this part of the world. Crimea is a peninsula. It is located in the Black Sea. In 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea. it was given to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Why? Khrushchev hoped the transfer would strengthen, quote-unquote, brotherly ties between the Ukrainian and Russian people. Both Russia and Crimea were part of the Soviet Union, so this transfer did not mean very much. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, Crimea joined it. The peninsula was given special autonomy. It remained home to Russian military bases. Moscow promised to respect Crimean autonomy. Many in Russia were of the opinion that Crimea should not have been allowed to join Ukraine. In 2014, when Yanukovych was ousted from power in Ukraine, Russian military began seizing government buildings in Crimea. Soon the entire peninsula was under military occupation. A referendum followed. On the 16th of March 2014, Crimeans voted to become a part of Russia. Was this vote legitimate? Well, it depends on who you ask. For Putin, this was Crimea's liberation. For the rest of the world, this was Crimea's annexation. The focus then shifted to eastern Ukraine, where Russia-backed separatists had seized territory. Ukrainian forces did not launch an all-out offensive at first, but on the 17th of July 2014, when a flight carrying 298 people was shot down by these rebels, Ukrainian forces decided to flush out the rebels. The separatists began losing ground, so the Russian army stepped in. They invaded eastern Ukraine and fought alongside the rebels. What followed was a series of talks between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. They resulted in the Minsk Accords. This was first signed in 2014. Both sides agreed on ceasefire and military withdrawal. Ukraine agreed to hold elections in the rebel-held areas. 8 years on, the Minsk Accords remain unimplemented. Ukraine stands as the largest European country excluding Russia. It covers an area of more than 600,000 square kilometers with a population of 44 million and a GDP of more than $155 billion. Per capita income, more than $3,700. Today, Ukraine is divided between East and West in more ways than one. The West sees itself as more European. The East is closer to Russia, be it in terms of geography or sentiment. In the West, most Ukrainians speak Ukrainian. In the East, a third are native Russians. In the West, Russia is looked at with suspicion. In the East, Russia is looked at through the lens of shared history and heritage. Ukraine also remains at war. Its forces are fighting the rebels in the East. Rebel leaders are ruling at least two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Together, they're known as the Donbas region. Russia has once again sent its troops. This time, they're stationed right at the border. What does Vladimir Putin want? For NATO to stop expanding. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance. These countries are the founding members of NATO. These countries joined it during the Cold War, and these countries joined after it. Ukraine wants to join NATO too, but Putin wants NATO to exclude Ukraine and every former Soviet state. And this is just half the story. Like I said, a lot is hidden in history. For starters, there is domestic politics. When Putin annexed Crimea, his approval rating skyrocketed. Keeping the nationalistic drum rolling helps the Russian president. Annexing parts of Ukraine also helps Putin restore Russia's superpower image. Again, back to history. Many Russians view Ukraine's independence as a mistake. It is true that Ukraine was ruled by Russia. In fact, Ukraine has barely remained independent pre-1991. There was a brief period before World War I, and then another stint in 1600. For the rest of its modern history, Ukraine was under Russia. 1 in 6 Ukrainians is an ethnic Russian. 1 in 3 speaks Russian as a native language. So Putin is right when he says historically they were one. But claiming Ukraine on the basis of colonial history is wrong. It will be like Britain claiming India or South Africa or Spain claiming the Philippines. Past imperialism cannot justify present-day expansionism. Here's what else history tells us. Ukraine was forcefully Russified. Cut to 1700, Russian leader Catherine the Great started Russifying Ukraine. Ethnic Russians were shipped to this part of the world. Schools were told to teach Russian language. By 1800, the Ukrainian language was banned. In 1930s, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin steered a famine in Ukraine. Millions of Eastern Ukrainians were killed. The area was then repopulated with ethnic Russians. In the 1940s, the ethnic Tatars were relocated. They too were replaced with Russians. There is a reason why Eastern Ukraine today has so many native Russian speakers. It was designed to be that way. Eastern Ukraine was always dear to Russia. It has coal, it has iron, fertile land. Its historical connection with Russia was forced. Putin time and again talks about the Holy Rus. He says Russians and Ukrainians are one people. 70% Ukrainians reject this thought. 72% consider Russia a hostile state. Today, 33.3% Ukrainians are ready to take up arms against Russia. 21.7% are ready to stage a civil resistance against Russia. 67% Ukrainians want to join the EU. 59% want to join the NATO. Meet the current Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He came to power in 2019 following a landslide victory. He is a vocal critic of Russia. Zelensky openly opposes Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. 73% of Ukrainian voters voted this man to power. Today, Volodymyr Zelensky represents the pulse of Ukraine, the Ukraine that wants to remain independent of Russia. But Vladimir Putin wants to become the man who revived Russian imperialism.
The Ukraine conflict has reached a boiling point. More than 100,000 Russian troops are bordering Ukraine, and there's serious concern that they may invade. It began in November 2013 with the Euromaidan protests. Ukraine's then pro-Russian government attempted to reverse long-running efforts to integrate the country with Europe. The people were not happy. Protesters took to Kiev's Maidan Square furious at the Ukrainian government's decision to choose closer ties to Russia. The scope of the protests soon widened, with calls for the resignation of President Viktor Yanukovych and his government. After 3 months, the protest evolved into a full-blown revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, as it was called in Ukraine. But it looked more like the beginning of a civil war. In February 2014, it all came to a head. Clashes between protesters and riot police turned deadly. 130 people died. On the 21st of February, President Yanukovych agreed to call an early election to let the people decide. But the very next day, he fled Ukraine ahead of an impeachment vote, eventually ending up in exile in Russia's south. Protesters took the capital's buildings, and eventually a pro-European government was installed. Ukraine was now closer to the West than ever before, but there were still parts of the country who had stronger links to Russia and wanted no part of being closer to the EU. A few weeks after the pro-Russian government was ousted, Russia seized the peninsula of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. The first land grab in Europe since the Second World War. Now, that move sparked international outcry and fueled an ugly conflict in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian government forces battled separatist groups backed and armed by Russia. Now, Russia always claimed it played no part in that conflict, but refused to engage with the Ukrainian president to resolve it. Ukraine and Western nations said Russia orchestrated a hybrid war by propping up the separatist groups to fight on their behalf. Out of it all, two breakaway quasi-states emerged, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The people there speak Russian and feel more culturally tied to Russia than Ukraine. They're not formally recognised as countries by the UN or even Russia, and the Ukrainian government has declared them terrorist organisations. In 2014, the crisis made international headlines. Malaysian airline Flight 17 was shot down over Ukraine on July 17 by a Russian-manufactured missile over an area controlled by separatists, killing all 298 people on board. Russia again denied involvement, but the many links tying them to the separatists made their claim of innocence hard to believe. It's estimated there have been more than 14,000 casualties on both sides since the conflict began, and deadly skirmishes and shelling continue to break out sporadically. As things stand, the Ukrainian government estimates around 7% of its territory is occupied by Russia or armed groups backed by Moscow. Which brings us to today. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is on the verge of entering a new phase, one which could be more deadly than the last 8 years. Why? Because other world powers may get drawn into the conflict. The US government, among others, is very alarmed because a successful invasion of Ukraine would establish Russia as a dominant expansionist power in Eastern Europe. It would make other democracies, like Taiwan, worry that they could be vulnerable to take over by nearby authoritarian countries like China. Britain's head of the armed forces, Admiral Sir Tony Ratican, has said that if an invasion takes place, the conflict that would ensue would be on a scale not seen since World War II. Putin is demanding that Ukraine be permanently barred from joining NATO. He also wants other NATO actions, such as stationing troops in former Soviet bloc countries, to end. NATO has said the demands are unacceptable and that joining the alliance is a right of any country and does not threaten Russia. Now, Putin's critics argue that what he really fears is not NATO, but the emergence of a democratic and prosperous Ukraine. That's something that many Russians might find appealing, given they live under Putin's increasingly autocratic rule. The next potential tipping point in the crisis will be when Washington sets out its formal response to Putin's demands. But for strategic and domestic political reasons, the US can't and won't give Putin everything he wants. The build-up of Russian military along Ukraine's east suggests Putin is prepared for serious conflict. And worryingly, Russian troops have poured into Belarus, Russia's ally, stationed just 60 miles or 95 kilometres from Kiev. Ukrainian troops, which are already heavily outnumbered by Russia, would have to be spread thinner elsewhere in order to protect the capital. Without enough manpower, they'll have to make difficult choices. Russia has the firepower to overwhelm the Ukrainian military, even with the extra support that has flooded in from the West. Taking on a nuclear power would risk all-out war, so sending troops from NATO and the West would be unlikely to happen. Instead, the West would likely retaliate with economic sanctions, cutting off Russia from international trade and business with the aim of tanking its economy.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. Today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets.
A main target proposed is the Nord Stream 2 gas line, a major potential source of income for Russia. But given that Russia has been under severe sanctions since Crimea was taken, it's unclear how much this threat will truly frighten Putin. In the meantime, it will be up to the Ukrainian people to offer resistance should the Kremlin send troops across the border. Ukraine's history has been one of constant invasion and occupation by other countries. With more than 30 years of independence, Ukraine has developed into a tough, proud, independent nation prepared to fight for what is their country and their territory. But for now, only Putin knows whether that resistance will be tested again.
And as the West threatened to cripple Moscow's economy with devastating sanctions, an ominous warning from Vladimir Putin to any country trying to interfere. You will face consequences you have never seen before, he declared. The dawn chorus that no one wants to hear. Air raid sirens in Kyiv, signaling that the full-scale invasion of a European country in the year 2022 was well underway. Conference dealing with the fallout of sanctions.
То, что происходит, вынужденная мера. Мы просто не оставили никаких шансов поступить иначе. Риски в сфере безопасности создали такие, что другими средствами отреагировать было невозможно.
The denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. That was his outrageous justification for all this. The first based on a lie, the second a euphemism for invasion. He may feel that he's on the side of history, fulfilling his legacy as Vladimir the Bold, the modern Tsar who is resurrecting the Russian Empire by occupying Ukraine.
So you can understand Putin's frustration with trying to keep all those countries as of one, you know. But I guess, you know, throughout history or whatever the case may be, those people want their own independence, you know, and who's to say we shouldn't give them their right to their own independence? But Hey man, it is what it is. Appreciate everybody watching. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, get down in the comment section, tell me how you feel about what's going on over there between Russia and Ukraine. But that's it, man. That's my take on that, and I'm gone.